Okay, a couple other things to think about as we get started. First is the second critical engagement essay is due this Friday. So please make sure to complete that. For those of you that completed the first essay, I have those are graded. I also gave you some comments, some things to think about. So you should be able to pull it up on Blackboard if you completed it and find the details under your grade. If you have any questions, or if for some reason you submitted it and you're not seeing the grade, get in contact with me about that. If you have any questions about anything any comments, or if you didn't complete the first one, you have some questions, feel free to get in contact with me about that. For those of you that did submit the first essay, everything looked really good on just about everybody. So there's a couple comments on a few people, but overall, looking really good to start with. So there's that. Secondly, a week from today is the first exam. So don't be lax about that. Don't forget that. If you have questions, don't forget the study guide posted on Blackboard. If you have questions about that and what to study about, or if you have questions about anything of what I'm looking for, feel free to get in contact with me about that as well. There are a couple of things that we have to finish up from last Wednesday's class, and so I want to finish up with that, and then we'll get into some other material for today. One of the things where we finished up is looking at this trajectory in Western culture that has been going on, that has moved, particularly Christianity, from an influential position. Now, Christianity is still very influential in the West, especially in the United States. And large numbers of people identify as Christians. There's still a lot of influence Christianity has politically. Less so in places like Western Europe than in the United States, but it's not the sky is falling approach, but it is important for us to see that we are in a position of seeing a transition taking place. And we've seen that over several different lectures as we've looked at a variety of things taking place. And so on Wednesday we were taking this historical overview of different people, different events, different movements that have taken place that have gradually shifted this power. And where we finished up was talking about how a variety of social scientists in the end of the 19th, early 20th century began offering approaches toward understanding religion as not some sort of given within human culture, but that it is something that human beings have constructed, that they use for a variety of reasons, with the goal of many of the people that we talked about, Freud, Marx, Feuerbach, just as examples of people hoping to see religion in broad, not just Christianity, but religion in general, be something that is gradually moved from the experience of human beings. And we finished up talking about the secularization thesis, this idea that a lot of social scientists had that as societies modernized, religion would become less and less important. Now, in some places, as we noted as we were finishing up, we've seen that take place. Europe is a good example where we've seen secularization increase as modernization has increased. Not so much in the United States, although as we talked about, maybe we're starting to see some of the fruits of that gradually the United States had become more religious over the 20th century, but now maybe we are seeing a decline in religion. A couple other things to keep in mind as we think about this 20th century development. One of the things with a lot of the social scientists were observing was a trend within both Europe and in the United States of thinking about religion as a private matter. Something it's your individual private choice. And probably most of us, if I'd asked before, would have agreed and thought about religion. Well, that's something private. It's not something that should have, you don't need to have too much in the public sphere about it. But again, that's a modern development. up until the 19th century, a lot of people did not believe this. Didn't even think of religion as a private matter. Religion was public. It was deeply interconnected with the state. It was something that should have an influence on society. And so, having religious reasons for acting in certain ways as a society, developing certain policies, that was a given in a lot of the United States and Europe, even in places where there was enshrined, for example, like in the Constitution, notions of separation of church and state, even though those words aren't used. But this idea of privatizing, religion being a private matter. Right? What you do in your home, it shouldn't have an impact outside of that. Also occurring in the 20th century, though, was this kind of kickback to this. And in the 19th century, we talked about how, with the development of evolution, with the development of criticism of the Bible in the sense of questioning how the Bible had developed, whether it was a historically reliable document, that there were some people that accepted those things, that wanted to say, we're going to modify how we view Christianity, how we interpret the Bible by modern life. Not everybody, however, accepted that. And so in the early 20th century, you see this pushback from very conservative Protestants who have become known as fundamentalists. Right? People that are trying to stop this transition. Right? They want to hold on to traditional doctrines of the Bible. They want to look at the Bible as historically reliable. That science, which had turned to evolution, was turning to theories and not facts. And so fundamentalism was an attempt to try and refrain or restrain this transition in the 19th century, or in the 1900s. And so it was a movement against that liberal Protestantism, right, adapting Christianity to modern times. By calling themselves fundamentalists, they were saying we're wanting to hold on to the fundamentals of the faith. And so there's that idea of, Christianity, there's at least a core of things that should not change. And so we're going to hold on to some traditional aspects. And in some respect, in the early 20th century, and so on the one hand, challenging liberal Protestantism. On the other hand, challenging things like evolution. And in some respect, fundamentalists had some success in the 1900s, the early 1900s, both politically and religiously, until they took on the issue of evolution, particularly in public schools. In the 1900s, there were a variety of laws in place in various states that prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools. Particularly, the one we're talking about here with the Scopes trial had to do with a law passed in the state of Tennessee. After the law was passed, there were a variety of people that decided they wanted to test this law and whether it was constitutional or not. And so in the tiny little town of Dayton, Tennessee, a man named John Scopes, who was the football coach, but sometimes substituted in biology, was willing to claim that he had broken the state law, that he had taught evolution in the public schools in Dayton. Now, it's a little unclear whether he had actually taught evolution. It seems that what's more likely is that he handed out some material that talked about evolution. And so it's unclear whether he actually stood up in a class and said, evolution's where we came from. But whether or not he did, he was brought to trial on that. And there was a huge trial. For the Times in the 1920s, it was a media circus. People from all over the country came to this tiny little town in Tennessee to talk about this great contest between science and religion. One of the lawyers for the prosecution, the people prosecuting Scopes, was a fundamentalist, and a famous fundamentalist named William Jennings Bryan. Bryan had been Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He had run for the Democratic nomination for presidency 3 times. Right? So he was well known. He had been a political figure, also a very strong fundamentalist. So he's kind of on the side. He comes to town. He's the focal point of the prosecution. On the other side, Scopes' defense attorney is also rather famous as a murder lawyer and an atheist. And so here are these two prominent figures, and it becomes very much about these two prominent figures, the struggle between religion, particularly fundamentalism, and evolution. Darrow, Clarence Darrow, the lawyer for Scopes, wants to bring in all these experts to talk about how evolution is a scientifically accepted principle. But the judge essentially says that's not the case here. We're not talking about that. We're talking about whether or not Scopes broke the law. It really becomes this circus when Clarence Darrow, the defense attorney, calls William Jennings Bryan, the prosecuting attorney, to the stand as an expert witness of Christianity, and gets him in all these kind of questions and really flusters Bryan and makes him look very foolish on the stand. And so ultimately, Scopes is found guilty of breaking the law. He is fined $100 for breaking the state law. That is eventually overturned on a technicality. The technicality was any fines over $50 had to be assigned by a jury, not a judge. And so because it was assigned by a judge, the case was kicked out. But ultimately, what it means for what we're thinking of is that fundamentalism comes out looking very, very bad out of all this. Right? Because the public media attention essentially makes Bryan look foolish. Right? That he's unable to respond to the things that Darrow is challenging him on. That this is something that fundamentalism, right? Fundamentalist Christianity is something rural. It's only people in the backwoods believe. It's anti-intellectual. All sorts of very pejorative types of things. So that most people today in Christianity would not want to be identified as a fundamentalist. Right? And so even rather conservative theologically people, right? People that believe the Bible is the Word of God, inerrant, right? Wouldn't want to be identified as fundamentalists, right? Because it's such a negative term. Now, part of that is coming out of this because fundamentalism wasn't actually rural. Most of the people that were fundamentalists in the early 20th century lived in cities. They lived in the north, right? So it wasn't a southern phenomenon. It's only later that it becomes a southern phenomenon. Many of the fundamentalists, prominent fundamentalists, had advanced degrees. They were doctors. They were PhDs. But the Scopes trial changes all of that. And so this marginalization of conservative types of Christianity. And then finally in our overview is the way in which science, especially in the 1900s, 1950s, becomes a philosophical system and not just a system of method and exploration and discovery. That there is an explanatory philosophical power to science. That a lot of people feel that science is not just about discovering truth and discovering how things work, but that it provides us a philosophically grounded view of reality. And that through science we can achieve utopia, right? The way society is going to be better is if we become more and more scientifically knowledgeable. And we see that even in our educational system, where there's such an emphasis on the STEM fields. Right? And the humanities and the arts are kind of pushed off to the side. Right? STEM is where it's at, science, technology, and engineering. Those fields are important, absolutely. But the idea that somehow our society is made better by those things, where philosophy, religion, literature, those things are not as important. Right? And so who would ever want to major in one of those things when you should be majoring in, right, the STEM fields? And so that's a product of this kind of better living through chemistry type of idea that comes out in the 1950s. Right? That the solution to all these problems is more and more science. So let's sum up, right? Tie it all together. What are some of the things that we note and pull out from what we've been looking at? So first of all, is this development of reason as an authority distinct from religion. And so one of the things we've seen as we went through scholasticism, into talking about Descartes and Locke, and into the Enlightenment, was this idea of reason and religion, or reason and revelation, being two distinct sources of truth. with reason being somehow distinct from religion. Like religion isn't reasonable. Right? And so there's reason and then there's religion. Right? And the two shall never meet is the way that a lot of people in contemporary society look at it. Right? So the one development is this source of reason as a distinct authority. Secondly is this distinction between religion and science, or science and revelation. That science is a separate area of truth. And that those who are in religion, right, those who are religious, cannot judge, right, the ideas of science. Science is a field to itself. So thinking about, as we talked about, Galileo, feeling that the church authorities shouldn't be judging scientific discoveries. They don't have that ability. Right? And up through evolution, liberal Protestantism, right, science being used to judge religion. Connected with that was the explanatory power of science. Not only is science, as we saw in this historical development, a distinct area of truth, but also it is the sole means for a lot of people of determining what happened, who we are, those kind of ideas. That everything is, in a sense, scientific. Now, most people wouldn't go to that extreme. Right? Most people would probably try to find some sort of balance between the scientific and the spiritual. But when you look at some of the extreme people out there, the so-called four horsemen of atheism, everything's scientific. We are totally natural creatures. There is nothing supernatural in our world. Another development that we looked at briefly was the decrease of social connections. As society has developed through the Industrial Revolution into the 20th century, we've gone from these extended familial networks to these nuclear families. And with that have come a variety of consequences. Some of them positive, perhaps, and some of them negative. But there isn't, for a lot of people, too many social connections that you have with a lot of people. Right? And so our society is kind of more individualistic. Now, in more recent years, there have been a variety of things that have tried to push back on that, try to develop more social bonds. But we have seen more and more throughout society an emphasis on the importance of the individual, the sovereignty of the individual, particularly the individual conscience, and really the power of the individual. And so, again, some of this important ideas, some of these things reflect some changes that perhaps needed to be made in how we viewed ourselves, but it's also led to a variety of consequences. Thinking about the narcissism that inhabits our society, the lack of connecting within religious bodies, that we're so not making bonds with our fellow Christians. We also saw in this trajectory a development of critiques of Christianity, the Bible. One of the things we didn't mention with all of this, of course, is the idea that it becomes more and more acceptable to critique Christianity and the Bible. And to the point where we are now that religion is fair game. Right? There's not that looking upon religion for some people as something sacred. Right? You don't joke about it, which, again, I'm not saying all of this is bad, but the idea is, religion is something that is open for critique. We also just got done talking about the idea of this development of religion as a private matter. And as we've increased as individuals, the focus of individualism, there's also been this privatizing of religion. Right? So religion, as it becomes more and more individualistic, becomes more and more private. But also, as we saw through the social scientific strand, that religion is not something needed in society for some people. And so today, we think about some of the the statistics we went through in a previous lecture about the increase of the unaffiliated. Right? That essentially what we have here is, of course, a difference between religion and spirituality. Right? And so a lot of people saying, well, I don't like organized religion. I don't like institutional religion. We've also seen, of course, this development of religious people looking foolish in general. Now, admittedly, some religious people make themselves look foolish. Right? There are a lot of people that we could point to that a lot of people would say, that person looks foolish, that person looks stupid. But this trend of people that turn to religion, being foolish, misguided, deluded, that, of course, is a development that we've seen here that's more and more marginalized religion, especially Christianity, in our culture. And then finally, developments within pluralism, the notion that religion can be, or truths can be found in all religions, relativism, what is true for me may or may not be necessarily true for you. Some of which we'll talk about later on. So historically, a lot of these trends and developments have worked together to bring us to where we are today. And in thinking about some of those slides we looked at in the previous lecture, of the different ways that Christianity has declined in numbers in the 21st century, other ways in which we can think of how Christianity can be marginalized in a variety of discussions. What questions do you have, areas that maybe need to explain in more detail or clarify? Having looked then at the status of Christianity, where Christianity stands, I want to move now into talking more discreetly about that idea of Christianity, right? And so we talked about the Christian cultural and heritage, kind of connecting now Christian and cultural together, thinking about what are the aspects of culture that come from Christianity, how is it that we think of Christianity, what is the Christian worldview, and what kind of impact that has on us as individuals, Christians in general, the West itself. Let's start with the question of defining worldview. As I mentioned on Wednesday, one of the terms for the study guide is worldview. This is the definition I want you to know for worldview. As I have said before, the slides are available on Blackboard, so if you don't get all of it down, have the chance, you can go back and look at those. But essentially, this idea of worldview, although we can come up with different definitions, in this case, worldview is an articulation of the basic beliefs embedded in a shared grand story that are rooted in a faith commitment and that gives shape and direction to the whole of our individual and corporate lives. Now, as we've looked at other definitions, there's some things that this does a good job pointing out. There's some things perhaps we could identify that are missing from this definition, but there are a couple aspects of it that I want to highlight regarding worldview. So first of all, one of the things that's pointed out in this definition is that worldview has to do with basic beliefs. And what does it mean, basic beliefs? Well, we're talking about the fundamental ways that we think about society, that we think about selves, that we think about the universe, that we think about life, right? All those core ideas, how the world works, who people are. Those are the kind of things included and incorporated in a worldview. The definition also points out that these basic beliefs tend to be embedded in a shared grand story. Worldviews are communal. Now, in more modern times, we have come to a position where we can have a kind of buffet approach to worldview, where we might take some elements here from this ideology, some from this ideology, and kind of banquet our worldview. But in general, worldviews are communal. They come from communities. They come from things broader than just the individual. Most individuals don't suddenly decide on a worldview that is completely separate from worldviews that have been around in other communities. And so there's that idea of the sharing of worldviews, but also the sharing of a grand story. Really, we could say all worldviews have a grand story that explains where the world came from, where the universe came from, where people came from. That shared grand story can be something very, very simplistic, or it can be very complicated, very detailed. But it's not just ideas, it's not just concepts. There is a story, there's a narrative that binds people and people sharing worldview together. With that is the faith commitment. Now, of course, if we're talking in the context of Christianity, a Christian worldview, we would understand and would be pretty acceptable of this idea of a faith commitment. But essentially, any worldview asks the people that are accepting it to trust that the grand story is true. Right? So you're asked to step out on faith. Now, there may be reasons for that faith, but ultimately it becomes this point of you have to trust that what you're being told is true. Whether that's a story of billions of years ago, the Big Bang happened, or in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, or, as some traditions do, the universe has always existed. Because we can't ever get back to those points, we have that faith commitment of, well, I believe this is true. Worldviews shape what it means to be you and what it means to be you with other people. And so it tells us, it helps us understand who we are. Right? Think about, if you were there for chapel, think about the point that was being made about, what defines us, who we are. Especially, of course, in chapel in the eyes of God. And so a worldview shapes what it means for us to understand ourselves, what it means to be me, but also how that relates to me among other people. Questions? Anything I need to clarify? Yeah.
Can you get back to the definition? That part was not on board.
That one's not on Blackboard? I apologize. I will get that up. I will get that up this afternoon.
Could you reiterate the last point on worldview?
Oh, the whole of our individual and corporate lives. Yeah, that it shapes not only us as individuals, but it also affects the different communities that we're part of. Right? So the worldview affects how I think about who I am when I'm with my church community, who I am at work, who I am with my friends. Right? When I engage in community with other people, worldview is shaping that. Other questions?
Do you believe that there's such a thing as an open worldview?
Well, the term open worldview can apply to a variety of things. Essentially, the idea of an open worldview is one in which there is something outside the natural world that incorporates or affects this world. And so a closed worldview is pretty, like a naturalistic worldview would be a closed worldview. Most religious worldviews would tend to be open worldviews, and that there's some force or power or being that it impacts who we are. Other questions? Places that need to clarify. One of the things that Goheen and Bartholomew point out in talking about this idea of worldview is that when we think about or encounter worldviews other than our own, or even in examining our own worldview, there are a couple of questions that are useful in thinking about differences, and thinking about how do these worldviews compare, or in thinking about our own worldview. And how can we investigate a worldview, right, is essentially what they're pointing out. And so these questions, these 7 questions, they posit as good ways to ask questions about reality. So how does a worldview think about the foundation of reality? What is the prime reality? Right? Is it something naturalistic? Is it a being like God? What's truly real? Because there are a lot of worldviews that would talk about things being illusory, things being temporary, and so what's the prime reality? What is truly real? What's the nature of the world around us? Where did it come from? What's our relationship to it? Thirdly, what does it mean to be human? Right? And so if you're thinking about, well, I as a Christian, what's the difference between Christianity and Buddhism, or Christianity and Islam? Well, one of the places we can find those differences is asking them, what does it mean to be a human being? What happens at death? What is it that takes place? Is it simply the cessation of life? Is there some sort of existence after death where you're in some sort of realm, living eternally as a spirit? Are you reborn into another life? Those kind of questions help us see how different worldviews look at the world around us and life. Why is it possible to know anything at all? How can you know that you know? What is it that makes you able to know? Is it because your senses are reliable judges of the world around you? Is it because of the neurological processes that take place in the human brain? Is it because, as some people thought in the 15 and 1600s, that God actively plants ideas within you? Right? And so you know because God works on the brain to help you know. How do we tell what is right and what is wrong? Is it simply a feeling? Is it because God has set a moral standard? Is it because within the universe works to judge what's right and wrong? And so when you do bad actions, bad things will come to you. When you do good actions, good things will come to you. What is the point of history? What is the point of this overarching development of human beings? Is it a tale told by an idiot signifying nothing? Is history going someplace? What is history all about? Now, why would you want to take the time to investigate worldviews? Why is it we should think about this only for ourselves, but also as we compare worldviews to others? Well, there are a couple of things to think about. First of all, worldviews shape so much of our lives. A lot of what we encounter, from our education to the media we consume, is shaped by a worldview. Now, that worldview may be something explicit. Somebody is actively trying to communicate a worldview to somebody else. It could be, on the other hand, something implicit. Right? A person is not necessarily trying to communicate, well, this is how you should act, or this is who you are, but they are still, in a way, communicating that. I mean, think about your favorite television show. What is it in that television show that communicates what reality really is all about? I mean, there are a lot of shows that have been around in recent years suggesting that reality can be something confusing or illusory, right? You think you know what's going on, but all of a sudden the rug's pulled out from under you, and what's really going on is something completely different. How do they talk about what it means to be human? What right and wrong is? All those kind of things come out in our media, in our pop culture. But on the other hand, a lot of the things that we encounter, how we view media, how we view our jobs, how we view education, how we view religion, a lot of that is shaped by, again, this implicit or explicit worldview that we've adopted, either intentionally or unintentionally, right? Something that's been shaped by our parents, something that may be shaped by culture, or something we have explicitly chosen, right? I am choosing to be, right, particularly in this context, Christian. And so we look at things by that worldview. Now, as we said before, a lot of worldviews today can be this kind of buffet, conglomeration of, well, I got a little bit here, I got a little bit there, this has shaped this part. But how we think about who we are and what we do, how we think about the people we encounter, are often shaped by our worldview. And that perception, of course, as we've talked about, affects our understanding of reality. When we think about how we know what we know, most of us take for granted that the sense experiences we have are reality. That there really is somebody up here speaking to you right now. That I'm not some sort of figment of your imagination. And that you're not some sort of figment of my imagination. And so our perceptions affect how we understand reality. But ultimately, it's important to recognize that in investigating worldviews, we bring to light, especially as we're looking at ourselves, bring to light a lot of things that we take for granted. Things that we just run on autopilot. We don't actively think, oh, I'm going to be kind to this person because I believe that all human life is valuable because God created humanity in His own image. Now, we don't think about that. We're kind because we're kind. But a lot of that has been shaped by worldviews. So in looking to examine a worldview, what is it that we need? What do we need to look for? Well, what's the grand story? In an academic sense, right? I mean, now if you're, just watching a television show and you're not going to sit there and say, so what is the grand story of human nature that this particular event is telling you, right? But in thinking in an academic sense, what we're doing here, right? What's the grand story that's being told? What are the fundamental beliefs? What are the key things that make up a worldview? What are the most important concepts or beliefs within religion, philosophy, ideology? And then thinking about, particularly, what are the consequences of that belief? If I truly believe that human beings are made in the image of God, how's that going to affect how I treat people? How's that going to affect how I view political policies on capital punishment, on taxation, on governmental programs like welfare, right? What are the consequences of accepting those beliefs? Now again, most people don't do this. We don't do this in our everyday lives. But in this class, part of that is getting you to think about these things, getting you to ask yourself, what's the great story that shapes my life? What is it that I think is most important? And once I think about those things, what are the consequences of that? If I really, really believe that, what does that mean? What questions do you have? What do we need to clarify?
So, if worldview is pretty much you just what you believe, no matter what influence, why did it only come up in the 20th century? Because it didn't exist really. I mean, the way we define worldview, it existed forever. We always had an opinion on it. So why is it so big in its place?
The idea of worldview really hits in the 20th century, largely due to a lot of those things that we pointed out in the previous section, with some of the philosophical reflection that develops, and the notion of modern life and modernity, and thinking about, and particularly in the latter part of the 20th century, people looking at this marginalization of Christianity and saying, well, what's replacing that? Since Christianity has been so influential. And so that's really where a lot of that really started to develop, is thinking about, now that we see Christianity kind of being pushed from the center, what's occurring there? And Goheen and Bartholomew really get into, I think, a pretty good discussion in some of the chapters. I can't remember if you read it yet, but it'll come up. But that's a really good question. Other questions?
Does the question of how do we tell what is right and wrong also take into consideration like younger people, and by younger I mean like children, and how they seem to, even without their parents' influence, seem to have some sense of right and wrong?
Well, I think that from a Christian standpoint, I would argue that we're embedded with a conscience, right? But there is also that idea of what we might call socialization, if we're looking at it from like a sociological or psychological standpoint, in that we socialize children. We socialize children to believe and accept certain things, particularly when it comes to values like what's right and what's wrong. And so children might have that innate sense of there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong, but what they're going to view as right and wrong is going to be shaped by their parents, their school teachers, their extended family, society, right, the media that they consume. And so there's that aspect of it. I believe that there are some things that are intrinsically right and intrinsically wrong without how I feel about them. Right? I could feel that some things are right and wrong. God, for me, God's the determiner of that. So there's something something separated from that. But as far as how I personally tell, it's a lot of what I've been socialized or what I've intentionally chosen. And so it's that process of childhood development has a big impact on that. What other questions? So let's break down the Christian worldview. Excuse me, lost a page of my notes. Let's break down the Western worldview first. What is it that is promoted in the West? So think about it. Our Western culture, what are some of the things that you would say? What's the great story being told in the West? What are some of the key beliefs or ideas that exist in Western culture today?
They were all considered equal.
All right, so the idea of equality, very important. In Western Europe, in the United States, a lot of emphasis on equality, and the idea of equality pushes a lot of the policy changes that we see in the United States, particularly recently, the idea of same-sex marriage. A lot of the argument for same-sex marriage had to do with notions of equality, right? So equality, very important in Western worldview. What are some other ideas or beliefs?
Relative truth.
All right, relative truth. All right, the kind of bringing in the equality, all truths being equal, right? Which makes truth relative. What else can you think of things promoted in our culture?
Self.
Right, the importance of the self, the importance of the individual.
You can go from nothing to something.
All right, yeah, especially in the United States, right? We have the American dream, all right? That you could start on the wrong side of the tracks and end up a CEO, all right? You could start in abject poverty and end up a wealthy billionaire. Anything else you can think of? Yeah, in a lot of ways, and that's kind of shaped and modified over time. Our connections with other places. We're seeing a lot more in the late 20th century into the 21st century. Globalization, right? We're connected with the rest of the world. Where in previous generations, a lot of it was American exceptionalism, right? We're different, we're separate, we're distinct. We're seeing more of those interactions, and so the West has modified its thinking. Anything else you can think of? Well, I think we've hit several of the ones that I've pointed out, maybe worded slightly differently, but this idea of progress, right? Both as a culture, as a society, as a species, as human beings, right? Progress is something very, very important to us. You know, we want to do better. We want to live better. We want to, physically be better. We want better technology. We want better culture, right? So we're wanting to see progress, socially, politically, individually. In general, the West has, sometimes more often than others, but traditionally, an optimistic view of humanity. Now, various times we've been more pessimistic. I think we're kind of in a pessimistic swing right now. We're kind of in a downturn about the power of human beings, and when you look at society, we see a lot of negative things. But in general, I think a lot of the Western worldview has been one of optimism, right? That kind of, you can do it, right? You can achieve it. The world is getting better. But like I said, it kind of comes and goes, and I think we're kind of in a downturn at the moment, quite understandably when we look at a variety of things that are happening politically, a lot of things that are happening among different cultures and different populations. We see a lot of the atrocities taking place in the Middle East, both from the Syrian government and from ISIS and some other things like that. Those kind of things make us go, well, really, are we really progressing as a species? Freedom and prosperity. I think those two things have a lot of things connected with it, right? That idea of equality we talked about, and the self, and that prosperity is what you're driving for, right? You get a job, you get the best job because you want to make money, you want to be prosperous, you want to have stuff, and so connected with that is a lot of consumerism. That how we recognize value of people, oftentimes in the Western worldview, is based on the amount of possessions they have, the size of their bank accounts, right, the kind of house they have, the kind of car they drive. And while probably most of us, who in the West would say, no, a person's more valuable, their value is based on other things, right? The general narrative in our culture is about those kind of things. If you think about the kind of people that are lauded and applauded. Finally, of course, we already touched on, but I think, kind of connected with progress and our optimism is the rather positive view of science and technology. That in general, most people in the West would say that development of science, development of technology leads us into a better state, right? It's optimistic that if we develop these things, we're going to be better. So we don't have time to address all of these questions, but think about these 4 questions related to some of those things. What are the greatest values in our society? Well, we talked about that a little bit, equality and the self. We don't have time to go back to this question, but it might be useful in thinking about this to go back and look at those diagnostic questions about prime reality and nature and those kind of things, and how does our society answer those questions. But this is the one I wanted to talk about here for a little bit. Given this breakdown of the Western worldview, what sort of impact do you think that that's made on our society? Those ideas of progress, optimism, freedom, prosperity, consumerism, science and technology. What impact do you see that having on Western society or society in the United States?
We depend a whole lot on technology, which is both good and bad, because we're able to do so much, but if something were to happen, we don't know how to actually use or act about it.
Yeah, and so we've kind of wedded ourselves to technology, and even those that would kind of cry about it or decry it, that this is horrible, it's pulling us further and further. most of those people have Facebook pages, right? And so they say, oh, Facebook and social media is separating us from each other. Yeah, right there you are, right there on Twitter, right? So, we have kind of this idea, this kind of this bifurcated idea of technology is bad, it separates us, but we're still going to be involved in it. All right? And technology can have both that impact socially as well as in other aspects, right? And so technology, of course, has brought us a variety of developments, let's say medically, things that doctors are able to diagnose better or able to address conditions earlier in someone's life because we have developed technology. Right? So there's some positive impacts on technology. There's maybe some places where it's negatively affected us and how we interact with people. To the point of, if suddenly it all went down, where would we be then? Well, some of us would be fine, but there are probably some people that would, not know what to do. Right? Think about, for example, those people that are so dependent upon social media status, and the celebrities in our culture who are famous for being famous. And it's not because they're sports athletes, it's not because they've done great work in the cinema or anything, written a fantastic novel. Those people are just famous because they have a lot of people that follow them on Twitter or have a lot of people follow them on Instagram. Well, if that's all gone, where are those people, right? A lot of those people so devoted themselves to that identity. Right? And so that can have an impact on people, so they've gotten their identity so wrapped up with technology that it's suddenly gone, and then they have to redefine themselves. Other impacts to some of those in our culture to some of those ideas.
With prosperity, again, can be good and bad. We talked about going from nothing to something, and that can either drive you to work hard and to be better than the generation before you, or it can cause you to be selfish and harm others just so you can get to the top.
Yeah, and a lot of that, of course, depends on the person, right? The person that's selfish is going to hoard their belongings. They're going to be so focused on themselves. But prosperity in itself isn't necessarily bad. A rich person, right, just by herself or himself, isn't necessarily bad. It's what they do with their money, right? And so it's not the money that's the problem. It's who the person is inside. But that push for prosperity can drive some people to just be so focused on that goal that they lose sight of their family, or they lose sight of the impact they're having on others. And so with a lot of those elements that we've put up, and others that we could probably bring about to talk about how to talk about the Western worldview, many of them can result in positive consequences or negative consequences. And a lot of it depends on the individual. And so the individual goes to extremes that can end up in difficulty, or it could be something positive. Let's turn then to thinking about, we already talked about some of this, the consequences of the Western worldview, so let's go ahead and move on. Thinking about the Christian worldview. Already, kind of by separating Christian and West, I'm suggesting intrinsically that there is something distinct from the Western worldview and the Christian worldview. That these two are something distinct, and maybe there are some places where the Christian worldview actually critiques the Western worldview. So we shouldn't have a very easy equation between these two ideologies, though sometimes we do kind of muddle them together. And so for the rest of today and into Wednesday, I want us to think about essentially these three questions. What is the grand story of the Christian worldview? How does the Bible address those diagnostic questions? And then finally, what are the things that are Christian values? What are our Christian values? What's most important in Christianity? Let's start first by breaking down the grand narrative. What's the great story that is present in Christianity? What is the narrative that establishes what it means to be a Christian. And I think, of course, we start with creation. Now, in thinking about a grand narrative of Christianity, an overarching story, in thinking about and starting with creation, what are some elements within creation and in the narrative of creation that are important to recognize? We're breaking down the Christian worldview. What are the elements? Right? Where do you start when you start with creation? You have to start with God, and God specifically as Creator. Right? And so, Christianity, the Christian narrative, starts with not just creation, but God as Creator. And with thinking about God as Creator, there are a lot of things that flow out of that are intricately tied to that first acceptance of God as Creator. So if you accept God as Creator, there are some things that will then lead you to. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, I think it's important for us to think about a bigger question, and that's, does God exist? Because the Christian worldview is so dependent upon God as Creator. And God is a variety of other things, but it hinges on that issue. Are there some elements within Christianity that would be useful if there were no God? Yeah, there probably would be some things. It would be useful for people to love their neighbors as themselves. And it'd be useful for a society to do that. It'd be useful as a society for people to be forgiving, compassionate, loving. But the Christian worldview hinges those elements on the idea that there is a God that lives, exists, and created the world. But as we talked about in a previous class, saying God exists because the Bible says so doesn't get us very far, especially with people that don't believe the Bible's true. So, are there some ways to talk about God and God's existence and to think about God in a way in which we can be reasonably confident that God exists? From a standpoint of, right, it's not just because the Bible says there are some things, some elements, there are some clues to God. I think that, as a Christian, if we honestly take a look at what the Bible teaches us in our own personal experience, we'd have to say, honestly, God does not overwhelm us with His presence. That the world around us, while it might speak to the existence of God, is not so overwhelmingly indicative, where we can be 100% sure in communicating to someone else. In such a way, the prime example of that is, or the prime reason we can say that is, people doubt the existence of God. If God were so evident in the world, it would overpower people where they couldn't believe God didn't exist. But even when we look in the Bible, we can see that that's the way God operates. God only rarely overwhelms people with proofs of His existence. A good example of that would be the apostles. The apostles, when you read the last chapters of the Gospels, couldn't doubt they encountered Jesus. And now, of course, I'm taking this as historically reliable, right? So I'm taking some things for granted here. But thinking if the Gospels are true, they couldn't doubt Jesus had resurrected because they had encountered Him, they had touched Him, they had eaten with Him, they had spent time with Him. But a lot of other people could doubt Jesus rose from the dead. And so this idea of God overwhelming us isn't true. So instead, what we have are what we might call, externally from the Bible, clues to the existence of God. here's some that people have pointed out that I think are pretty reasonable, pretty good clues to accepting God's existence outside of, as a separate way to think about the Bible. First of all, is everything in the universe is contingent. What does that mean? It means that everything relies on something else for its existence. And everything we encounter in the world. You are not a necessary being. Your existence is not necessary, meaning that you had to exist. You exist because of the people that created you physically. That there was a male and a female involved in your creation. Trees exist because seeds were planted. So we have cars because people made them. There are no necessary beings in our physical universe. They all come from somewhere. Why would the universe itself not be contingent? That it had to come from something else. That there has to be a being that is non-contingent. That there is a necessary being that started this. Now again, it'd be very easy for an atheist to try and take that apart, but in general, as we think about it, everything in this world is contingent. Why wouldn't the universe itself be? Secondly, within nature, there are constants that exist in our universe that are necessary for life to exist. Gravity. Gravity has to remain fairly constant for us not to fly off the world, right? Physics trusts that there are constants in the world, in the universe. A lot of these demonstrate, the fact that there are constants that exist demonstrates design. Now the response, of course, would be, life exists because it just so happens that there were the characteristics for life to exist. That would be the response of someone, a naturalistic approach. Right? That we exist because conditions were just right for life to exist. And so in one sense, we'd say it demonstrates design. On the other hand, they'd say, well, no, it just happened that the conditions were right. Well, let's just think about it. Let's say you're playing poker, which you shouldn't do, for money. And someone just happens to deal themselves 4 aces in poker 20 times in a row. Would you accept that he wasn't cheating? That he just happened to deal himself 4 aces 20 times in a row? Would you accept the idea that there are an infinite number of universes, an infinite number of possibilities, and you just happen to be in the one where this dealer dealt himself 4 aces 20 times in a row? Most of us would say no. Right? There's got to be some sort of cheating. Let's say firing squad. Most places don't have a firing squad. You can still be executed by firing squad, I believe, in Utah. Firing squad, 50 skilled markspeople, right? Skilled at shooting. They're shooting at someone to execute this person 6 feet away, and they all miss. That there was no conspiracy. Would you believe that there was no conspiracy? Most of us say no, but there has to have been something, right? Something hinky going on, right? Something that's not on the level. So if we look at it that way, why not think about the fact that all these things are constant because they were designed to be, not that it just happened to be. How about the regularity of nature? We tend to reason inductively. Not all the time, right? Sometimes there's deductive reasoning, but when we look at different things as they happen and draw general principles, it's even done in science. But once we have that inductive principle, we assume that it's true. Right? The assumption is that tomorrow, water will boil at the same temperature as it boils to death. Why would this be so? Why assume that it's the case? Right? Why do we assume that nature is regular? Why do we have a sense of beauty? Now again, all sorts of explanations would be developed, could be developed, responses, people trying to address this, saying, oh, well, we just have beauty because socially we've developed culture. Well, yeah, what we think is beautiful is going to vary by culture, ethnicity, and race, and nationality, but there are senses of beauty. We have, as a species, aesthetics. What is beauty? What is beauty if it's not a sense imbued in us by a Creator? So, here we have this idea that our senses seem to indicate to us that there is a God. This is a very easy concept to grasp and accept as human beings. It's very easy for human beings to grasp the idea that there is a God. Yet, if we took a solely naturalistic approach to this, we would have to say that something happened back in our species development, that it made it better for human beings to survive to believe in God. I mean, that would have to be, the naturalist evolutionist assumption would be that there is a belief in God because it evolved and made us better as a species for survival. So, if we can't trust our senses to tell us the truth about God, how can we trust our senses to tell us the truth about anything? When belief in God is a very easy concept to grasp through our senses. So, the atheist, the naturalist, assumes our senses are wrong about God. You're wrong. Even though you look at your senses, beauty through music, through sight, we tend to trust that, but we're wrong. Well then, how can we be right about science? About reason? How can we trust reason if we can't trust our senses? But we tend to trust our senses, right? We tend to think that if we see something, it really is there. If we hear something, there really is something producing it. So wouldn't that indicate that perhaps there was a God who made us in such a way that most of the time, all things being equal, we can trust our senses? I mean, yes, certainly, drugs, other chemicals can make us, put us in such a way where we cannot trust our senses. But generally, most of the time, all things being equal, we can trust our senses. What about the question of morality? Now, here again, the naturalist, the atheist, would argue morality is a concept that has been developed by society. It is a concept used for social control. Right? So civilization does not devolve and break down. But when we think about that, and atheists have had problems with what is called moral proof for the existence of God for centuries, that they feel that it doesn't prove the existence of God. But still, let's think about it. The naturalist, the atheist, would have to argue that any sort of morality, because it is socially constructed, is relative. Right? It's not absolutely true. It is relative based on the society. And they would point to a variety of societies and say, look, in this society, this particular action, let's use polygamy. In this particular society, accepted. In this particular society, not accepted. In this particular society, it's okay to do this thing. But in this other society, it's not. So morals are relative. Okay. Do women have rights? Do women have human rights? Sitting here today, most of us would say, yes, of course. There are some societies that don't believe women have human rights. So who's right? We say, oh, we are. Why? Why are we right about women's rights and other societies are wrong? Isn't that just ethnocentric prejudice that somehow we in the West have a better concept than some of those cultures where women don't have human rights? If morals are relative, animal rights. Should animals have rights? There are people that would say, yes, animals should have rights. Other people that say, no. Should stronger animals be held accountable for violating the rights of other animals? The stronger cheetah that takes apart the gazelle, should that be held accountable? Now, I see a lot of smirks, right? Understandably so, right? We think that's ridiculous. But why then should stronger human beings be held accountable for violating other humans' rights? If we are simply animals, just of a higher order, why should we hold other people accountable for moral failures in society? Why are human beings not allowed to act according to their animal nature if they're just higher evolved animals? Well, it's not good for the species. Says who? Maybe it would actually be better for the species if the stronger human animals were allowed to go out and wreak havoc. Think about this argument that is often made from this standpoint, and sometimes not even from just an atheistic naturalist standpoint. No one should impose their moral views on others because everyone has the right to find truth inside her or himself. Right? That idea is promoted in our culture. Maybe you hold that today. But think about it this way. What about ISIS? They believe they're right. So why should we try to keep them from doing that? Well, we'd say, what's wrong with what they're doing? It's wrong that they're executing Christians and minorities of other religions. It's wrong that they are imposing. Says who? Morals are determined by the individual. Why are you trying to take your morality and impose it on someone else? What's wrong with genocide? You see, when we come to these kind of things, women's rights, ISIL, genocide, it's not just about these things are impractical. It's impractical to oppress women, might be the response. But it's impractical. Right? Society's better when women have rights. Which is true, I think. But as far as a moral argument, people don't hold that. They believe it's wrong. Genocide is not just impractical, it's wrong. But if there is no moral sense endued by the Creator, it is not wrong. It's simply wrong because society says it's wrong. Yet nobody is a moral relativist in practice. They might claim moral relativism, but when you get to something like genocide, nobody's going to just say it's impractical. They will say it is wrong. And if it is wrong and not just impractical, that is a universal. And if there are universals in our society, where did they come from? So while a lot of people will try to say the moral proof doesn't help us that much, I think it really does tell us a lot of things about the existence of God. I think we can be relatively certain that God exists. And that while He doesn't overwhelm us with His existence, there are a lot of things that point us in that direction. We'll pick up on Wednesday, talk more about the breakdown of the Christian worldview, and get into discussion of Christian values.